Would you like to take photos that look like that? Well, stay tuned. Hello, welcome to my channel, Georgia Photography, where I talk all things photography. So pretty much since August, I have been obsessed taking photos of the moon. And this year, we've had a few supermoons. A supermoon is just a phase of the moon when it's full, and I believe that it's more full when it's a supermoon. So if you're thinking about getting into taking photos of the moon, something to just be aware of are these different moon phases. It could be waxing, waning, or another phase. You just need to plan ahead and look at a calendar you could find online to determine which phase the moon's going to be in. Something else to keep in mind is what kind of weather you're going to be having. I would recommend going out on a clear night, perhaps away from some downtown city lights, where you could get a clear view of the moon. There won't be any large buildings or trees or hills or mountains obstructing your view. I also like to think about when the moon is on the horizon, what kind of landscape area is around me so that I can incorporate that into one of my photos. Now, if you just want to get a photo of the moon itself, you could pretty much get a shot of it any time of night. It could be directly over your head, and I think your photos will turn out fine. And as far as the weather outside, if it's cooler, just dress appropriately, dress warm, maybe bring a flashlight, and also know if you're on location early, which direction the moon will be coming up in. There are apps that you could download to your phone to determine that. As far as lenses, I would recommend a 300mm telephoto lens at minimum. If you have anything more than that, that's great. It'll just help you fill the frame even more when you take your photo. Something else that you should bring would be a tripod. And when you're using that tripod, I would recommend setting a timer. And you're going to want to do that so that you could avoid your camera shaking when you push down on a shutter button so your moon photos don't turn out blurry. Now, as far as your camera settings, I've heard that the Looney 11 setting is a good base to start off. That basically just means that if you set your aperture to 11, your shutter speed and your ISO need to match. So for example, if your aperture is set to 11, you want to make sure that both your shutter speed and your ISO are both set to 100. Now with that said, if you need a little more light maybe, you boost your ISO up to 200, make sure that your shutter speed is at 200. If you crank your ISO up to 400, make sure that your shutter speed matches at 400. Now when I'm out taking photos, I experiment with the aperture, and I could have it set anywhere from f8 to f11. I would also even recommend playing around with your shutter speed as well. The moon does, believe it or not, move pretty fast in the night sky, so at minimum, I would recommend having a shutter speed set to 100, 125, and maybe even set to 400 or 500. And as far as your ISO, I would recommend keeping it as low as you can, just so long as it's exposed properly. You could probably get a good exposure at 100, 200 ISO, and I'm sure that would be fine. As far as your color settings, I usually keep mine on automatic white balance. I think you could probably also get away with a daytime white balance as well, because the moon is very bright. And as far as your focus, I would recommend using manual focus. Typically what I do is zoom in as far as I can on the moon, and many cameras have a feature where you could zoom in even further for focusing purposes. I have a Canon, and so there's a little plus button on the back of my camera, and I'll try to center the moon as best I can, and I'll zoom in on it or push in on it using that feature and turn the focus ring so that I could get the sharpest image of the moon as possible, just to try and capture as much detail of the craters and the surface as I can. I already mentioned that I take my photos using a tripod. That is a good piece of gear to bring because, as I mentioned, you would want to set a timer so that when you take your photo and you push on a shutter button, your camera doesn't shake. And typically I'll have my timer set to 2 seconds. You can also do 10 seconds. I noticed that on my tripod that if I extend the top part, the camera tends to sway back and forth, and it may take a few seconds for it to settle into place. So you might be safest if you set your timer for 10 seconds. And something to keep in mind that when you're taking photos of the moon, it requires a lot of experimentation, and you may need to adjust some of your settings, whether it's your ISO, your shutter speed, or aperture. You may need to practice, and over time you will get better at it. I've had a few of my friends ask me on social media what phone I use to capture the moon. As far as I know, I don't know any phone that has a lens powerful enough to capture the detail. That may change in time with things like AI implementation, but if you want to capture a really good image of the moon, you're probably going to need to use a DSLR camera with a telephoto lens. Well, I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing. And if you're interested, go back and check out some of my other videos where I give tips on taking photographs of waterfalls and taking photographs in the fog.